Let's continue our discussion on the no arbitrage theory. Let's start with the slide number 21. In the slide number 21, we have two equations. The first equation is express as the dollar amount, and the second equation is the same equation but is represented in terms of percentage. And let's take a look at the second equation. Second equation says that the left-hand side, the lowercase r, that's a rental rate. Rental rate equal to risk-free rate plus the property tax rate minus the lambda time RF plus W, and this component is account for the property tax deductibility when we file for personal income tax. And then the delta is the depreciation maintenance rate, and minus G being the appreciation rate of the property value, plus gamma. Gamma is a risk premium because buying a home you will need to put into a lot of money. There ought to be a risk premium associated with this large lump sum of investment. And let's take a look at the next slide. Here we plug in some numerical number, try to make sense how to interpret this particular equation. And let's suppose that the risk-free rate RF is 4.5%. Let's assume that the W is the property tax rate, 1.63%. That is the effective tax rate average for the state of Vermont. And then we have lambda, 25%. Lambda is the marginal personal income tax rate. Let's assume that to be 25%. And the RM is the mortgage rate. Let's assume that's 5.5%. And then the delta is 2.5%. That is the appreciation rate for the structure. In the United States, the structure of the home usually depreciates at a rate about 2 to 3% a year, depends on the condition of the structure. And G is the appreciation rate. So here we assume 3.5% each year. That is kind of on par with the CPI, and that is the usual appreciation rate for a property, for a home property. And then gamma is 2%. Here we just plug in whatever number. 2% is a kind of number that we use in academic research, although we do not really know exactly what that size is supposed to be, but let's just plug in 2% there. So plugging all of those numbers to the right-hand side of the equation, as you can see that for the state of Vermont, the user cost, that's the right-hand side of the equation, is 5.3475%. This means that when someone buys a home, each year, the carrying cost of owning that home is 5.3475% of the property value. So if this home is $1 million and you bought this $1 million home, basically each year you are paying the cost in the amount of $53,475,000 US dollar. That's how we look into this number. And the no arbitrage theory basically says that we wanted to kind of make a comparison between owning a home or renting a home, and which one is cheaper, okay, because it gives us the same utility in terms of utilizing this same home. So the cost of the owning a home, that's if that's indeed 5.3475%, then we need to compare with the cost of renting the home, right? For this $1 million, if every year we would need to pay $40,000 US dollar for renting this same home, then the rental rate is 4%. $40,000 a year relative to $1 million, that's 4%. Then renting a home would be cheaper. Then we all, any rational investor ought to choose renting a home. That would only cost us $40,000 instead of owning a home, buying a home. That would cost us $53,475. Okay, so in this particular situation, the home price is too high. It's not attractive. It's too expensive. Okay, therefore, from the long run perspective, let's say 10 years, 20 years, that we ought to see the home price need to kind of coming down in one particular way or the other, such that it's going to make owning a home not so expensive. On the other hand, if currently we rent a home would cost us $60,000 a year for this $1 million property, then we have a rental rate of 6%. Then this 6% would be too high, would be relatively high compared with the 5.3475% of owning this particular home. If this is the case, then buying a home, owning a home is an attractive option. Then the fundamental, the current market value of the property is relatively inexpensive compared with renting this particular property. Then from a long run perspective, we ought to see some sort of housing appreciation capacity or ability down the road. Okay, so this is how we use this particular equation. We try to compare the cost of buying a home versus the cost of the renting a home, and then say something about whether the home value, home price right now is relatively expensive or relatively inexpensive, to say something about the fundamental value of a property. Next slide. So let's play with this equation a little bit and then try to extract some economic intuition. Let's say that the first question, what happened if the interest rate dropped? What would happen to the home price? Okay, based on this equation. If the interest rate drops, then the first parameter that we need to pay attention is that RF on the right hand side of the equation. So RF is going to drop. When RF drops, the entire right hand side equation is going to drop. Okay, so owning a home becomes relatively cheap, and therefore making owning a home more attractive, and that we can imply that the home prices has potential to go up. So we're talking about leading to an appreciation of the home value. So that will be the answer. Next question. If income tax is raised, what would happen to the user cost? So income tax rate, that would be the lambda. If the lambda goes up, because we have a negative sign associated with the lambda, so the user cost is going to come down. The user cost come down on the right hand side just means that the buying a home is relatively attractive. Okay, so if we have a tax law overhaul down the road that's going to raise the personal income tax, then you are going to find quite a lot of people find buying a home to be a very attractive option. And so that would be the income tax rate implication. And the bottom one, if investor anticipate high price appreciation, what happened to the user cost? And price appreciation would be the G. Okay, on the right hand side of the equation, if G goes up, because G is associated with negative sign, so the entire right hand side is going to come down. That would be the user cost will come down. It means that buying a home is become more attractive when we have a good feeling about the appreciation associated with this particular property. Next slide. And suppose that you buy houses and rent them out. So let's assume that you are a landlord. If you expect a high price appreciation, would you accept a lower rent? As we just mentioned earlier, if we anticipate a higher G, because G is associated with a negative sign, it's going to lower the entire right hand side. So from a no arbitrage perspective, the left hand side auto coming down. That means that the rental rate, we can accept a lower rental rate. Okay, when we accept a lower rental rate, it means that we are willing to pay for this property at a higher price when the rent is relatively less. Okay, so that means that we are willing to pay for a high price. The home prices will be relatively expensive. And this is a kind of phenomenon that we have been seeing for a big city like San Francisco, Boston, New York City, Los Angeles. Those are the cities that have been experiencing continued growth over the past 50, 60 years. And if we look at those cities that their rental rate have been historically relatively low, and because the investor, the landlord are willing to buy those property at a relatively high price due to their high expectation toward appreciation of the market value. Okay, so the price to rent ratio is relatively high for those cities. Next slide. And what happens? So here, if we look into this particular theory, look at the right-hand side of the equation. There's one parameter we need to pay particular attention. Okay, the parameter that make the most difference, and that would be the G. G, that would be our expectation toward appreciation of the property, play a fundamental role in terms of shaping the property valuation. Okay, this G, okay, over the past 100 years, historically speaking, is only about 3.5% in the United States. Traditionally, in the United States, when we buy a home, we do not expect a whole lot of appreciation. But from time to time, we do have some sort of unrealistic expectation toward appreciation. For example, before 2008 financial crisis, from sometime about 2003 all the way to 2007, the majority of American households anticipate double-digit appreciation during those years. But those are relatively abnormal in the history of the United States. For most of the time, our property market is a relatively mature market that gives us an average about 3.5% rate of return. That's about it. And 3.5% rate of return is no higher than T-bill that you'll be able to earn. Okay, so no, overall speaking, it's not that attractive. And if the entire property grow at 3.5% in terms of the value, and what happened to the structure? It turns out that due to the technology advance in construction, the construction cost for building a home actually does not grow at 3.5%, at a rate slightly lower than 3.5%. And if the structure, the cost does not grow at the 3.5%, while entire property grow at the 3.5%, it just means that the land, okay, appreciate at a rate that is slightly above 3.5%. Okay, so this is what happened in the United States in the more recent decades, that the appreciation of the home is more driven by the land appreciation, and then kind of also amplified a little bit by the increase in construction cost. So that's the situation that we have here. And this G in many emerging economy, their G is higher than our. In the United States, we're talking about, historical speaking, 3.5%. But in China, over the past 20 years, that G is close to double digit. Okay, and in recent 2 to 3 years, it had dropped substantially. But if you look into the past 20, 30 years, this G in China has been quite substantial. But it does evolve as time goes by. When the country's economy becomes more mature, we see this G coming down. Similar kind of thing happened to Japan before 1990. There was a period of 20 years that in which the Japanese housing prices appreciate more than 10% a year for 20, 30 years. But after 1990, we see a large substantial depreciation in Tokyo's residential property. It dropped 70%, 70% over the next 10 years. So, when you have a unsustainable appreciation rate, is often the case that associated with the asset bubble, eventually leading to the collapse of a housing market. Next slide. And this theory has its own limitation, as I mentioned quite many times. It's a no arbitrage argument in the sense that based on a long-term perspective, so we cannot use the result from this particular theory to make a near-term or a short-term prediction about the home prices. Okay, but it does provide us some perspective on the fundamental value of property, whether it's too high or whether it's too low from a long-term perspective. Next slide. And this equation basically says that there is a direct relationship between the rental market and the user market. That would be the purchase market, only the ownership market. So ownership market and the rental market, they are related in a positive fashion. Okay, and this is a journal article from year 2008, right after financial crisis, from Wall Street Journal. At the beginning of the financial crisis, a lot of people make the argument, according to this story, say that the economy at that time started to tank, and a lot of people losing their money due to foreclosure, and therefore there would be a strong need for renting a home because they would need to live somewhere, and it's going to make the rental rate to be higher. But our theory tells us that no, that's not the case. Okay, when the ownership market is not doing well, the rental market is not going to do well either, because that one is the left-hand side of the equation, one is the right-hand side of the equation. And it turns out that our theory is correct. Okay, and as you can see in the next paragraph, that the rental rate start to drop. And what's the reason? It turns out that during that period of time, yes, indeed, a lot of people lost their home. But you know what? They moved back to the basement of their parents' home instead of renting an apartment. So the rental rate dropped when the financial crisis kicked in. So we see that positive association. Okay, when the ownership market does not do well, rental market does not do well. And here would be the same thing. Right now we have economic crisis due to the pandemic. If the housing market down the road will not perform well, at this moment we don't know that yet, because this is the very beginning of the pandemic. If the pandemic lasts for a long period of time, yes, there will be a chance that the housing market is going to come back. When the housing market comes back, then the rental market usually will come back as well, based on our prediction from this no arbitrage argument. Next slide. Let's perform an application. Let's make a comparison between Beijing and New York City. And the rental rate in Beijing in year 2015 is only 2%. Today it's about 2% as well. Okay, this rate had not been changed that much. It's only about 2%, very, very low. And how about in New York City? In 2015 and also today, this number is pretty much the same. It's about 4%. Okay, so why the Beijing rental rate 2% is only a half of the rental rate in New York City, 4%? The reason is because the homeowner in Beijing has a very different kind of home appreciation expectation compared with the homeowner in Manhattan about the home appreciation. In general, due to the past experience, the homeowner in Beijing, they anticipate a much greater amount of home appreciation rate than the New York City homeowner. As a result, that the Beijing homeowner are willing to accept a lower rental rate. They are willing to buy the property at a higher price because for appreciation instead of the income, instead of getting the rental, the rent from the renter, from the tenant. Next slide. And the next slide kind of talking about, this is what we have learned from our previous topic, from the appraisal topic, Y0 equal to R0 plus G. Here say that Y0 is the internal rate of return, and that is given by the external financial capital market. And Y0 has two components. One is the cap rate, R0. The other one is the appreciation rate. When cap rate is high, G will be low, relatively low, and vice versa. So R0 and G have this kind of inverse relationship, very much like the way that we just talked about there. The rental rate and the appreciation have this they have this kind of negative association, this kind of negative relationship. They all tell us the same intuition, same story. Next slide. Let's look into one particular big city, Shanghai in China. As you can see that those are the house price index from 2003 all the way to 2017. And as you can see that the home prices went up by 300% during these 17 years. So that's a lot of the housing price appreciation. And due to the housing price appreciation, let's see what kind of impact that they bring to that particular society. Next slide. The debts went up. Okay, the debt in China had quadrupled since 2007. And the reason is that the property is highly leveraged. When you buy a home, you only put down 20% and you probably borrow 80% as a mortgage. And for commercial property, same thing. You maybe only use 30% of equity, you use 70% of the debt. So when you have a home price appreciation, you have a property appreciation, there will be a lot of construction associated with a lot of the use of debt. So the entire nation is highly leveraged. Next slide. And this is what happened to the debt to GDP ratio from 2007 to 2014. And if you spot that China, then you can find along the y-axis you have about 80%. And that means that during these 7 years, China have increased its amount of debt within the entire nation to its own GDP by 80%. That's almost one GDP. Okay, one entire economy. Okay, so that's a lot of the use of the debt. When you highly leverage, when you borrow a lot of the debt, let's look into the next slide. That during the same time we have a lot of output. We built in China. They built tons of the building. So the notion of a ghost town and empty building, etc. So what happened to the housing occupancy rate? And in year 2012, and it's only a half of the residential space that you have actually people living there. So there's another half of a residential space that they are just being built and put in there, and no one is using that, being empty. And of course, this is quite wasteful. Okay. Next slide. So let's summarize the possible consequence of the unrealistic expectation toward appreciation. When we have a lot of housing price appreciation such that investors have unrealistic expectation toward appreciation, they think that the home are going to have, the price is going to go up, then what would happen? One, lower cap rate. That means that given relatively small amount of rent that you'll be able to collect, you are willing to pay for a large amount of money for that particular property, leading to a low cap rate. And relatively speaking, high property prices. And there's a lot of demand because people want to do the speculation. They want to buy property not because they are going to use the property. They just hope that the prices will go up in the future such that you'll be able to make money. So there will be oversupplies of the property. When you have oversupply property, it means that you build too much. And construction is a major source of the air pollution, so it leads to smog. And high vacancy rate, you build too much, okay, you don't use half of them. And overly leveraged, the entire nation borrows so much money, and there will be interest and principal you will need to repay down the road. And you create some sort of financial sustainability issue down the road. Maybe lead to default, maybe lead to bubble burst. Okay, those are all possibility. So that would be the consequence that when the property market is overheated, when the investor have unrealistic expectation toward housing appreciation. Next slide. And this is what happened in China. Vanke, Chinese name is Wan Ke, and this is one of the 3 largest home builder in China. At the end of the year 2018, the stockholder meeting, they put into 3 Chinese characters there, and it's mean that the survival. So they were been in survival mode for almost 2 years. Almost 2 years that they have a lot of, because they borrow quite a lot of debt. This company is about 85% leveraged. They only have 15% equity, but they borrow 85% debt. So tremendous amount of pressure on the interest payment, etc. So we don't know whether it will default down the road. Let's wait and see. Next slide. And when the property prices are too high, another social consequence is that the housing would be unaffordable. For example, number 1 in this statistics in terms of price to income ratio, the number 1 is Beijing. For those people who live in Beijing, buying a home is close to impossible. The price to income ratio is 48. What does this mean? It means that for a typical household, they will need to earn 48 years of household income. And that 48 years of household income would be good enough, okay, for them to buy a 2-bedroom apartment in Beijing. 2-bedroom apartment, okay, 48 years of household income. And a very important information in this computation is that this is based on the assumption that this household do not have any consumption. They save every dime from their household income. They do not eat, they do not entertain, they do not do anything, and just accumulate, just save their household income for 48 years. Then they can finally afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Beijing. And 48 years, that is longer than the number of years a typical household or person would be able to work. So this is a mission impossible. And what happened to Shanghai? 43. It takes 43 years of household income. And on the other hand, the most expensive city is New York City. That's 12. Okay, of course you know that the property value in Manhattan is very expensive, right? Okay, but that's just 12. And Beijing is 4 times of the magnitude. That the price to income ratio is 48. Next slide. Okay, and let's look at the land price. Okay, in terms of the U.S. dollar. Okay, all those numbers are in U.S. dollar, and just from this particular number, as you can see that the per buildable square meter in Shanghai, the price is the most expensive one is 1,100 US dollar, and at the same time in Manhattan, the most expensive buildable square foot would be only 800 US dollar. As you can see that the land price in Beijing is more expensive than the land price in Manhattan. And of course, you know that a typical wage in Beijing is only a small fraction of the typical wage in Manhattan. And that says something about how unaffordable the housing price is in Beijing. Next slide. Okay, we have another assignment, and here initially is a group assignment, but because right now we have unusual circumstances, so this will be an individual assignment. And this assignment is to study the housing market in Burlington and the neighboring city. You can do this online, okay? And your task is to use the no arbitrage framework to analyze the local housing market to answer the following question. Is this a good time to buy a housing property in Burlington based on this no arbitrage analysis? So you will need to find out all of those parameters on the right hand side of the equation, and also you need to find out the rental rate on the left hand side of the equation. And all of those numbers you should be able to Google and then obtain those information. For example, risk-free rate. You can go on Yahoo Finance and find out the 10-year T-note yield. That would be a good proxy for risk-free rate. And there are certain kind of numbers you may need to make some assumption. Please go ahead making those assumptions. Okay, and I would not challenge your assumption. I would not challenge your estimate, those parameters. But once you make those assumptions, okay, or some sort of refinement of those estimates. And I do want to see that you perform analysis to make a comparison. And this analysis is a comparison of the rental rate versus the user cost. And then based on this comparison, you reach a conclusion and say something about whether renting the property is a better idea or owning the property is a better idea. And that would be what I want to see. And for this assignment, keep it short. The writing should be just about maybe 1 page. Okay, 1 page would be good enough. And then of course, at this time, just email that to me. Okay. Again, this is an individual assignment. The task is that you will need to go through Google research to come up with some sort of estimate for the rental rate and for the user cost, and then make a comparison. Say something about where they're owning the property versus renting the property, which is more attractive. And then say something about whether there is a potential for housing appreciation or depreciation based on this particular analysis. And if you have any question about this assignment, do not hesitate to email me, and surely I will give you further guidance. And the due date for this assignment would be let's have this for 14 days. Okay, that will be 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks from today. Thank you. Bye-bye.